The funeral bells had barely stopped ringing when 8-year-old Emily Harper reached for the cowboy's weathered hand, her small fingers trembling, not with fear, but with the weight of a promise she'd carried like a stone in her chest. Will Harper stood frozen as the child's whispered words cut through the Colorado wind. "That's the woman my mama wanted you to love." Udee! Across the cemetery, Sarah Whitmore's tears fell silently onto the dusty earth of Silver Creek, unaware that a dying woman's final wish was about to reshape 3 broken hearts. Subscribe to witness how love finds its way through the deepest grief. The September sun hung merciless over Silver Creek's small cemetery, casting harsh shadows between weathered headstones that had witnessed too many farewells. Will Harper stood rigid as carved stone, his calloused hands gripping his hat brim until his knuckles turned white, watching as they lowered Mary's pine coffin into the unforgiving Colorado earth. The preacher's words drifted like tumbleweeds across his consciousness, dust and wind and meaningless comfort that couldn't fill the hollow space where his sister-in-law's laughter used to live. Around him, the small gathering of townspeople shifted uncomfortably in their Sunday clothes, their faces etched with the particular sorrow that comes from losing someone too young, too vital, too necessary to the fabric of their small world. The sound of dirt hitting wood echoed like gunshots across the prairie silence, each thud a reminder that some wounds never heal, only learn to bleed quietly. Emily Harper stood beside him like a small sentinel, her black dress too large for her thin frame, inherited from a neighbor woman's charity and smelling faintly of lavender and other people's grief. Her dark hair, so much like her mother's, was braided tight against her skull, but rebellious strands escaped to dance in the autumn wind that carried the scent of dying grass and distant snow. Will had promised his brother Thomas, before consumption took him the winter before, that he would care for Mary and Emily, a promise that felt like carrying water in cupped hands, always slipping through his fingers despite his best intentions. The child had barely spoken since her mother's fever broke into eternal silence 3 days ago, her eyes holding depths that no 8-year-old should possess, as if she'd aged years in the space of a heartbeat. When the preacher finally closed his worn Bible and the mourners began their slow dispersal toward town, Will felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders like a yoke he'd never learned to bear gracefully. The cemetery would soon be empty, except for the dead and the living, who couldn't yet bring themselves to leave. Sarah Whitmore stood apart from the main gathering, her presence as quiet as morning mist, her hands folded carefully over a small bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked from the meadow behind the schoolhouse. She had taught Emily for only 2 months before Mary's illness took a turn toward the inevitable, but something about the child's fierce intelligence and gentle spirit had carved a place in her heart that now ached with sympathetic loss. Her own black dress was simple, practical, the kind worn by women who understood that grief was a luxury they couldn't afford for long. There were lessons to plan, children to teach, a life to rebuild in a town that seemed to specialize in taking away the things that mattered most. The wind caught her auburn hair, pulling it loose from its careful arrangement, and she tucked the wayward strands behind her ear with the unconscious grace of someone accustomed to being overlooked. She had come to pay respects to a woman she'd barely known but deeply admired, Mary Harper, who had faced her illness with the kind of quiet courage that made heroes of ordinary people. As the other mourners began their retreat towards Silver Creek's dusty main street, Sarah remained, her green eyes fixed on the small figure of Emily Harper, wondering how a child so young would navigate a world suddenly emptied of its most essential warmth. The cowboy, for that's how Sarah thought of Will Harper, though she knew his name and reputation as a man who could gentle the wildest horse and face down trouble with steady hands, seemed carved from the same unforgiving landscape that surrounded them. His face, weathered by sun and wind and the particular hardships that came with life on the frontier, showed no emotion beyond a tightness around his eyes that spoke of grief held carefully in check. She had seen him in town occasionally, always polite but distant, the kind of man who carried his solitude like armor, protecting something fragile beneath the surface that he couldn't afford to let the world see. There were stories about Will Harper, how he'd lost his own wife in childbirth 5 years ago, how he'd thrown himself into ranch work and raising horses with the desperate intensity of a man trying to outrun his own shadow. Sarah had never spoken to him beyond brief nods of acknowledgement when their paths crossed at the general store or church, but she recognized the particular loneliness that clung to him like dust, the way grief could hollow a person out until they became more absence than presence. Now, watching him stand guard over Emily's sorrow while wrestling with his own, she felt an unexpected kinship with this man who seemed as lost as she often felt in this harsh, beautiful country that demanded everything and gave back only what you could wrestle from its reluctant hands. The afternoon light began its slow fade toward evening, painting the cemetery in shades of gold and amber that made even sorrow seem beautiful. And still the three of them remained, the cowboy, the child, and the teacher, bound together by loss and the strange intimacy that comes from sharing the weight of goodbye. Emily's small hand had found its way into Will's larger one sometime during the service, and he held it carefully, as if she were made of spun glass and might shatter if he gripped too tight or let go too quickly. The silence between them was not empty, but full of the things that couldn't be spoken, the fear of what came next, the terrible responsibility of continuing when the person who made life make sense was gone. The way love could feel like both blessing and burden when it was all you had left of someone. Sarah watched this tableau from her respectful distance, her heart aching not just for Emily's loss, but for the way Will Harper's shoulders seemed to carry the weight of the entire world, and she found herself wondering what it would feel like to help shoulder that burden, to offer comfort to a man who seemed determined to face his trials alone. The wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of the winter that would soon claim the high country, and Sarah knew that whatever happened next would change all of their lives in ways they couldn't yet imagine. As the sun touched the horizon and painted the sky in shades of fire and farewell, Emily Harper finally stirred from her silent vigil, her small face turning up toward Will with an expression that seemed far too old for her years. The cemetery had emptied of all mourners save the three of them, and the silence was broken only by the distant sound of horses and wagons making their way back to town, carrying the living away from this place of endings toward whatever comfort they could find in familiar routines and warm suppers. Sarah began to gather her courage to approach them, to offer whatever small comfort she could to a child who had lost everything and a man who seemed determined to bear his burdens alone. But something in Emily's posture stopped her. A tension, a gathering of purpose that suggested the little girl was preparing to do something that would require all the courage her 8 years had managed to accumulate. The moment stretched between them like a held breath, full of possibility and dread, and Sarah found herself frozen in place, sensing that she was about to witness something that would change the careful distance she had maintained from Will Harper's grief and Emily's need. Emily's fingers tightened around Will's hand with surprising strength, and when she spoke, her voice carried the clear, unwavering tone of someone delivering a message that had been entrusted to her by forces greater than herself. "Uncle Will," she said, the words cutting through the evening air like a blade through silk, "Mama made me promise to tell you something important when she was in the ground and couldn't change her mind anymore." Will's entire body went rigid, his weathered face turning toward the child with an expression caught between hope and terror, as if he knew that whatever Emily was about to say would either save him or destroy what little peace he'd managed to construct from the ruins of his life. The wind seemed to pause in its restless movement across the prairie, and even the distant sounds of Silver Creek settling into evening quiet faded to nothing, leaving only the sound of two hearts beating and the weight of a dying woman's final wish hanging in the air between them. Sarah, still standing at her careful distance, felt her breath catch in her throat as she recognized the solemnity of the moment, the way Emily had transformed from grieving child to sacred messenger in the space of a heartbeat. "She told me to wait until after the funeral," Emily continued, her dark eyes never leaving Will's face. "Because she said, grown-ups sometimes make promises they don't mean when they're scared of losing someone. But promises made to the dead are different. They're the kind you have to keep, even when they hurt." Will knelt down slowly, bringing himself to Emily's eye level, his hands shaking slightly as he placed them on her small shoulders, and Sarah could see the way his throat worked as he struggled to find words for whatever revelation was coming. The child's face was serene in the way that only children can achieve when they're absolutely certain of their purpose, and she reached up to touch Will's cheek with the gentle confidence of someone who had been entrusted with healing a wound she was too young to fully understand. "Mama said you've been alone too long," Emily whispered, her voice carrying across the cemetery with the clarity of church bells. "And that being alone was making you forget how to be happy, how to be the kind of man who deserves good things." The words hit Will like physical blows, and Sarah watched his carefully constructed composure begin to crack, revealing glimpses of the raw pain he'd been carrying like stones in his chest. "She said there was a woman in town who was alone too, and that maybe if you both stopped being so scared of getting hurt again, you could help each other remember what it feels like to have someone to come home to." Emily's small hand moved from Will's cheek to point directly at Sarah, who felt the world tilt on its axis as she realized she was no longer an observer, but a participant in this moment that would reshape all their lives. "That's the woman my mama wanted you to love," Emily said, with the matter-of-fact certainty that children bring to the most earth-shaking revelations, and Sarah felt her knees go weak as the full weight of Mary Harper's final wish settled over her like a mantle she had never asked to wear. Will's head turned slowly to follow Emily's pointing finger, his eyes finding Sarah's across the cemetery with an expression of such raw vulnerability that she had to grip her bouquet of wildflowers to keep from reaching out to him across the distance that suddenly felt both infinite and non-existent. The air between them seemed to shimmer with possibility and terror, and Sarah realized that everything she thought she knew about her quiet life in Silver Creek had just been swept away by a dying woman's hope and a child's unwavering faith in the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. "Mama said Miss Sarah has kind eyes," Emily continued, oblivious to the earthquake she had just triggered in two adult hearts, "and that she's been sad too, but the good kind of sad that means she knows how to love something enough to miss it when it's gone." Will rose slowly to his feet, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face, and she saw in his expression the same mixture of longing and fear that she felt coursing through her own veins like wildfire. The distance between them, perhaps 30 feet of cemetery ground, dotted with weathered headstones and wild grass, felt like an ocean that neither of them knew how to cross. And yet, Emily's words had built a bridge that neither could ignore. Sarah's hands trembled as she clutched her flowers, her mind racing with the implications of what the child had just revealed, that Mary Harper, in her final days, had thought of Sarah not as a stranger, but as a potential salvation for the man and child she was leaving behind. The weight of that trust, that hope, that sacred responsibility settled over Sarah's shoulders like a cloak she wasn't sure she was strong enough to wear, and yet she found herself taking a tentative step forward, drawn by something stronger than fear or doubt, or the careful distance she had maintained from Will Harper's complicated grief. "She made me promise to tell you both," Emily said, her voice growing stronger as she sensed the shift in the air around them. "That love isn't something you have to earn or deserve. It's something you choose, and that choosing it doesn't mean you're forgetting the people who came before." The sun had nearly disappeared behind the mountains now, painting the sky in deep purples and golds that made the cemetery feel like a cathedral, and Sarah found herself walking slowly toward Will and Emily, her heart pounding so hard she was sure they could hear it across the evening stillness. Each step felt like a leap of faith, a movement towards something she couldn't name but desperately needed, and she saw Will's expression shift from shock to something that might have been hope as she approached. Emily watched their careful convergence with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully delivered a message that had been burning in her chest for days, and when Sarah finally stood close enough to see the flecks of gold in Will's brown eyes, the child reached out to take both their hands in her small ones. "Mama said to tell you that love isn't about replacing what you've lost," Emily said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone far older than her 8 years. "It's about making room for something new without letting go of what came before." The three of them stood there in the gathering darkness, connected by a child's courage and a dying woman's hope, and Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a door opening that she had kept carefully locked since coming to Silver Creek, a willingness to risk her heart on the possibility that love could indeed bloom in the soil of shared sorrow. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky above them, Emily released their hands and stepped back slightly, her mission complete, her small face glowing with the satisfaction of someone who had kept a sacred promise. "Mama also said," she added with the casual tone children use when delivering the most profound truths, "that you should probably start by talking to each other because she was tired of watching you both be lonely when you could be lonely together instead." The simple wisdom of it, the idea that loneliness shared might become something else entirely, hung in the air between Will and Sarah like a challenge and an invitation. And Sarah found herself looking into the eyes of a man she had admired from afar, and seeing not just grief and strength, but the possibility of something she had almost given up hoping for. The cemetery around them seemed to hold its breath, as if the very dead were waiting to see whether the living would have the courage to honor the gift they had been given. And Sarah realized that whatever happened next would require a kind of bravery she wasn't sure she possessed. The courage to open her heart to a man whose own heart was still healing, to trust in a love that had been born from loss and blessed by the dying. The days following Mary's burial moved like thick honey through Silver Creek, each hour stretching longer than the last, as Will found himself caught between the weight of a promise and the fear of what it might mean. He spent his mornings tending to the horses with unusual intensity, brushing their coats until they gleamed like polished copper, as if the repetitive motion could somehow organize the chaos in his chest. Emily had taken to following him around the ranch with the quiet persistence of a shadow, her small hands always busy with some task, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, braiding wildflowers into crowns that she would leave on her mother's favorite chair. She never spoke of that moment at the funeral, but Will could feel the expectation radiating from her like heat from a summer stone, patient but unwavering. The child seemed to understand something about love and loss that escaped him entirely, something that made her eyes hold depths far beyond her 8 years. When she looked at him, Will felt as though she could see straight through to the parts of himself he kept carefully hidden, the loneliness that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat, the fear that he might never be worthy of the kind of love Mary had described in her final letter. The letter itself lay folded in his shirt pocket, growing soft from handling, its edges worn smooth by his nervous fingers. Mary's words had been simple but devastating in their clarity. "Will, I know you think you're not meant for love, but you're wrong. Sarah Whitmore has a heart big enough to heal yours if you'll let her. She's been watching you from afar, waiting for a sign that you might see her too. Don't let fear rob you of the happiness you deserve. Emily needs to see that love can bloom even in the darkest soil." The weight of those words pressed against his ribs like a physical thing, making it hard to breathe whenever he thought too long about their implications. How could Mary have known about the way his pulse quickened whenever he glimpsed Sarah's auburn hair catching the light through the schoolhouse window? or the way he found excuses to ride past the school just to hear the sound of children's laughter mixing with her gentle voice. The idea that his feelings might be reciprocated seemed as impossible as catching moonlight in his bare hands. Yet Mary had never been one for idle speculation or wishful thinking. Sarah, meanwhile, had thrown herself into her teaching with a fervor that bordered on desperation, as if keeping busy enough might somehow dull the ache that had settled in her chest since the funeral. Her students noticed the change in her, the way she lingered after lessons to organize already perfect supplies, the way her usually warm smile seemed to require more effort than before. She found herself staring out the schoolhouse window during quiet moments, watching the horizon where she knew Will's ranch lay hidden beyond the rolling hills, wondering if he ever thought about that moment when their eyes had met across Mary's grave. The memory of his gaze, so full of pain and something else she couldn't quite name, haunted her dreams and made her wake with a strange mixture of hope and terror. She had loved Mary Harper like a sister, had spent countless evenings at the ranch, helping with Emily's lessons and sharing quiet conversations over cups of coffee that grew cold as they talked. Mary had possessed an uncanny ability to see into people's hearts, to understand the connections that existed beneath the surface of polite society, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her friend had been trying to tell her something important in those final weeks. The town itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to shift or settle in the wake of Mary's passing. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store with the efficiency of a military commander, had taken to watching Will and Sarah with the keen interest of someone who understood that the best stories often began with the most unlikely circumstances. She had seen the way Will's shoulders straightened whenever Sarah entered the store, had noticed how Sarah's cheeks flushed pink when someone mentioned the Harper Ranch in casual conversation. The older woman had lived through enough seasons of love and loss to recognize the signs of hearts circling each other like cautious animals, drawn together by forces they couldn't quite understand or control. She found herself hoping, with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had watched too many chances slip away, that these two wounded souls might find the courage to reach for each other before fear convinced them it was safer to remain alone. Emily, with the intuitive wisdom that children sometimes possess, began her own quiet campaign to bring the adults in her life together. She started asking Will if Miss Whitmore might come for dinner, suggesting with innocent persistence that the teacher looked lonely eating by herself in the boarding house. When Will would deflect with gentle excuses about not wanting to impose, Emily would fix him with a look so reminiscent of her mother that it made his chest tighten with recognition. The child had inherited Mary's gift for seeing past the walls people built around their hearts, and she wielded that insight with the fearless determination of someone who had already lost too much to let fear dictate the future. She began leaving small gifts on Sarah's desk, wildflowers picked from the meadow behind the ranch, smooth stones that caught the light just so, drawings of horses and sunsets that spoke of a child's understanding that beauty could exist alongside sorrow. As the week drew to a close, Will found himself standing in his kitchen as the sun set, holding Mary's letter and feeling the weight of decision pressing down on him like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Emily sat at the table, carefully writing her letters on a slate board, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration, and the sight of her, so much like Mary in her quiet determination, made something crack open in his chest. He thought about the promises he had made at Mary's bedside, about the way love sometimes required a leap of faith that felt more like falling, and he realized that perhaps the greatest honor he could give to Mary's memory was to believe, as she had, that hearts could heal and love could bloom even in the aftermath of loss. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made the mountains look close enough to touch, their snow-capped peaks gleaming like promises against the endless blue sky. Will stood before his shaving mirror, his hands trembling slightly as he worked the razor along his jaw, trying to convince himself that his decision to attend church had nothing to do with the fact that Sarah would be there, playing the small organ with her graceful fingers, dancing across the keys like butterflies. Emily sat on his bed, swinging her legs and watching him with the knowing expression of someone far older than her years. Her Sunday dress already perfectly pressed and her hair braided with the kind of precision that spoke of a child learning to take care of herself too soon. She had been unusually quiet since breakfast, but Will could feel the anticipation radiating from her like heat from a forge, as if she sensed that something important was about to shift in their carefully ordered world. The church bells began their slow, melodious call across the valley, their bronze voices carrying on the morning air like a summons to something larger than themselves. And Will felt his resolve crystallize into something that felt almost like courage. The walk to town stretched before them like a journey into unknown territory, Emily's small hand tucked securely in his as they made their way down the dusty main street. Silver Creek on Sunday morning had a hushed quality, as if the entire town was holding its breath in anticipation of the weekly gathering that brought the scattered community together under one roof. Will nodded to neighbors and tipped his hat to the ladies, but his attention kept drifting toward the white-painted church at the end of the street, its simple steeple reaching toward heaven like a finger pointing the way home. He could hear the organ already, Sarah's playing floating through the open windows with a sweetness that made his chest ache with something he couldn't quite name. Longing, perhaps, or the recognition that some kinds of beauty were worth the risk of reaching for them. Emily squeezed his hand as they climbed the church steps, and when he looked down at her, she smiled with such radiant hope that he felt his last defenses crumble like walls made of sand. Inside, the church was filled with the warm golden light that seemed to exist only in sacred spaces, dust motes dancing in the colored beams that streamed through the stained glass windows like visible prayers. Will and Emily found seats in their usual pew, 3 rows from the back, close enough to participate, but far enough away to maintain the careful distance he had cultivated since Mary's death. But today, something was different. Today, he found his gaze drawn inexorably toward the front of the church, where Sarah sat at the small organ, her auburn hair catching the light like burnished copper as her fingers moved across the keys with practiced grace. She wore a dress of deep blue that brought out the color of her eyes, and when she turned slightly to check the hymnal, Will caught a glimpse of her profile, the gentle curve of her cheek, the way her lashes cast shadows on her skin, and felt something shift inside him like tectonic plates finding new alignment. The music she played seemed to wrap around his heart like silk ribbons, each note a small revelation about the beauty that could exist in the world if one had the courage to truly see it. The service passed in a blur of familiar rituals and half-heard sermons. Will's attention divided between the pastor's words about faith and redemption and the way Sarah's shoulders moved as she played, the graceful line of her neck as she bent over the keys. When it came time for the final hymn, her voice rose above the congregation's, clear and sweet as mountain water, and Will found himself singing along for the first time since Mary's funeral, his bass voice joining the chorus of voices that filled the small church with something that felt like hope made audible. Emily looked up at him with surprise and delight, her own small voice adding to the harmony, and in that moment, Will understood something about the way music could heal the places in the heart that words couldn't reach. As the last notes faded into silence, he felt a strange sense of completion, as if some part of himself that had been holding its breath for months had finally remembered how to exhale. After the service, the congregation spilled out into the bright morning sunshine, clustering in small groups to exchange pleasantries and catch up on the week's news. Will found himself lingering near the church steps, Emily's hand still in his, both of them watching as Sarah gathered her sheet music and prepared to leave. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to solitude, her gestures economical and precise, but Will could see something in the set of her shoulders that spoke of loneliness carefully concealed. When she finally emerged from the church, her eyes met his across the small crowd, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, connected by an invisible thread that pulled taut with possibility. Emily, with the perfect timing of a child who understood more than she let on, tugged on Will's hand and whispered, "Papa Will, ask her to come for Sunday dinner. Mama would want us to share our table with someone who looks so lonely." The words hit him like a physical blow, not because they were wrong, but because they were so perfectly, devastatingly right. Sarah had been walking toward the boarding house, her steps measured and deliberate, when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Will and Emily approaching, both of them wearing expressions of nervous determination that made her heart skip like a stone across water. Will removed his hat, his dark hair falling across his forehead in a way that made her fingers itch to smooth it back, and when he spoke, his voice carried the rough edge of a man forcing himself to be brave. "Miss Whitmore," he said, the formal address feeling strange and inadequate for what he was trying to say. "Emily and I were wondering if you might join us for Sunday dinner. The house has been too quiet since—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, but Sarah understood what he couldn't say, felt the weight of Mary's absence in the space between his words. Emily stepped forward, her small face serious and hopeful, and added, "We have pot roast, and Papa Will makes the best biscuits in all of Colorado, and I think you might like to see Mama's garden. She planted roses that smell like heaven." The invitation hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed, and Sarah felt her careful composure begin to crack under the weight of their kindness and her own desperate longing for connection. The morning sun cast long shadows across the schoolyard as Sarah stood at her classroom window, watching Will's familiar figure approach on horseback, with Emily perched behind him in the saddle. Something had shifted in the days since their conversation by the creek, a subtle change in the way he carried himself that spoke of decisions made and fears faced. Emily waved enthusiastically from her seat, her small hand cutting through the morning air like a bird taking flight, and Sarah found herself smiling despite the nervous flutter in her chest. The sight of them together, the tall cowboy and the small girl, created a picture that tugged at something deep within her heart, a longing she had kept carefully buried beneath layers of propriety and caution. Will dismounted with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle, then lifted Emily down with gentle hands that spoke of practice and care. The child ran ahead toward the schoolhouse, her dark hair streaming behind her like a banner, while Will followed at a slower pace, his hat in his hands and his eyes fixed on Sarah's face through the window. There was something different about his expression today, a quiet determination that hadn't been there before, and Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat as she recognized the look of a man who had made peace with his ghosts. The morning light caught the silver threads in his dark hair, and she found herself thinking that he looked younger somehow, as though some invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The school day passed in a blur of lessons and recitations, but Sarah found her attention constantly drawn to Emily, who seemed to glow with an inner light that hadn't been there since before her mother's death. The child participated eagerly in every activity, her hand shooting up to answer questions and her voice clear and strong when called upon to read. During recess, she gathered wildflowers from the edge of the schoolyard, weaving them into small bouquets with the skill of someone who had learned the art from loving hands. When Sarah asked what she was making, Emily simply smiled and said they were for planting, for growing something beautiful where there had been only emptiness. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself stealing glances out the window, watching for Will's return with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. When he finally appeared, riding slowly down the dusty main street with a small wooden box balanced carefully in front of him, she felt her heart begin to race with a rhythm that seemed to match the steady clip-clop of his horse's hooves. Emily noticed him first, her face lighting up with joy as she pointed toward the window, and soon the entire class was pressed against the glass, watching as the cowboy dismounted and approached the schoolhouse with purposeful strides. Will knocked softly on the doorframe, his presence filling the doorway like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. In his hands, he carried a small wooden box that had been sanded smooth and stained the color of honey, its surface gleaming in the afternoon light. Emily ran to him immediately, her small arms wrapping around his waist in a gesture of pure affection, and Sarah felt something shift inside her chest as she watched the way his large hand came to rest protectively on the child's head. When he looked up and met her eyes, she saw in his gaze all the hope and fear and tentative love that she had been carrying in her own heart, reflected back at her like sunlight on still water. The wooden box, he explained quietly, contained seeds that Mary had saved from her garden, varieties of flowers and herbs that she had tended with loving care throughout the years of her marriage. Emily had asked him to bring them to the school, to plant them in the small plot of earth behind the building, where they could grow and bloom and serve as a living reminder of love that transcends death. As Sarah took the box in her hands, feeling the weight of the seeds and the promise they contained, she understood that this was Will's way of saying yes to the future that Mary had envisioned for them, his way of planting hope in ground that had been watered with tears. Together, the three of them walked to the small garden plot behind the schoolhouse, their footsteps creating a rhythm that seemed to echo with the heartbeat of new beginnings. As they knelt in the rich Colorado soil and began to plant Mary's seeds, Sarah felt the last of her reservations crumble away like dust in the wind, replaced by a certainty that some loves are meant to grow from the ashes of loss, blessed by those who have gone before and tended by those brave enough to believe in tomorrow.